Chicago, late February. 11:30 p.m. He stood up. From the wheelchair, the one everyone believed he needed. Ellie froze in the doorway. "How long since I came home?" Cole said. The paralysis was never real. He had faked it to find the traitor who sold his location the night someone tried to kill him. 3 weeks of watching. His girlfriend arrived 3 hours after the shooting, white flowers. $600, her first words. "Darling, I've been talking to Martin about the board exposure." She never asked if he was in pain. But the housekeeper he'd never once spoken to in 4 years left wildflowers with no name, no card, and walked away before anyone could thank her. Cole Harrington thought he was running a test. He had no idea what it was really testing him for. This is where it begins. If this story already has you hit like, subscribe, and don't go anywhere, you're going to want to see how this ends. Cole Harrington had survived 14 assassination attempts in 20 years. The 15th should have killed him. It didn't, and that, it turned out, was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him. Because a man who survives what should have ended him starts to believe he's untouchable, starts to stop asking the right questions, starts to look in the wrong directions. Cole was about to learn the difference between surviving and living. It was going to cost him everything he thought he had. Thursday night, late February. He was leaving Meridian, his private restaurant on Michigan Avenue. When it happened, a black SUV pulled away from the curb ahead of them. 3 shots, clean and fast. The way professional things are. His driver was killed instantly. Cole took 1 bullet through the left shoulder. A second grazed his rib cage. He survived because his security team responded in 4 seconds. And because whoever hired the shooter wanted him scared more than they wanted him dead. That was their mistake. Cole Harrington did not scare. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already thinking. His shirt was soaked through. His shoulder felt like someone had pressed a hot iron into it and left it there. He did the math anyway. 6 people knew his route that night. Marcus, his doctor, Vanessa, his girlfriend, Dean, his right-hand man, his 2 personal guards, both now dead on the pavement behind him, and his assistant, who had been with him for 9 years. He went through the names once. Then he stopped talking entirely. He let them think the pain was worse than it was. Marcus treated him in the private medical suite on the 8th floor of Harrington Tower, a full floor converted for exactly this kind of night. Cole lay in the quiet and watched everyone who came through the door. Not with his eyes, with the part of him that had built an empire by reading people before they knew they were being read. His father Arthur arrived first, 40 minutes after the call. He sat beside the bed and said almost nothing. Cole watched him and saw what he always saw. Assessment, calculation. Arthur Harrington was measuring the damage the way a man measures a quarterly loss. He had always loved Cole the way he loved the Empire, which meant he loved what Cole represented more than who Cole actually was. Cole filed that away. He had been filing it away for years. Dean Calloway came in an hour later with a folder of operational reports. Efficient, concerned in exactly the right places. He asked twice about the timeline for Cole's return to work. Not once did he ask how Cole was feeling. Cole noted the difference between those 2 things. Vanessa arrived 3 hours after the shooting. She was dressed like she was coming from dinner, which she probably was. She brought white flowers, around $600 worth, wrapped tight in black paper. She touched Cole's hand and said she'd been scared. Then her first full sentence was about the press. She had already told reporters it was a random mugging. Cole watched her eyes when she said it. They were not scared, they were managing. Nobody else came. The room between visitors was very quiet. Then a small alert pinged on the nurse station monitor. Someone had left flowers at the front desk, wild ones, wrapped in brown paper rather than cellophane. No card, no name. The person had walked away before anyone saw them. Marcus pulled up the corridor camera, a young woman in a gray coat. The housekeeper's uniform was visible underneath. She had set the flowers on the counter and left quickly. The way people leave when they've done something right, and then immediately feel embarrassed about it. She wasn't looking back to see if anyone noticed. That was the part Cole couldn't shake. He rewound the footage. Watched it twice. She hadn't waited to be thanked. She hadn't even waited to be seen. He didn't know her name. That bothered him more than it should have. Later, when Marcus had gone and the room was dark, and Chicago outside the window was doing what Chicago always does past midnight, Cole thought about the people who had moved through that door. His father came to assess the damage. His right-hand man came to ask when he could work again. His girlfriend came with expensive flowers and talked about managing the story. And then there was the woman in the gray coat who left wildflowers with no name on them and walked away before anyone could see her do it. Here is the thing about power that nobody tells you. It doesn't show you who people are. It shows you who they need to be around you. And those are two very different things. Cole had built an empire on that distinction without ever understanding how lonely it was. He called Marcus. I need you to falsify the records. Spinal shock from the fall. Paralysis. Lower body. I need to be in a wheelchair when I go home. Marcus was quiet. Then, you want to fake being worse than you are. Someone on my inner circle gave them my route tonight. Someone with admin access deleted specific footage from the primary server. I need to find out who, and I can only do that if they think I can't fight back. Cole, I'll be careful, you always say that. He prepared the records anyway. After midnight, Cole reviewed the secondary backup server. The one his security chief didn't know about. The one that caught what the primary system missed. Footage from 3 nights before the shooting. Underground garage, Dean Calloway's car. Parked in a corner nobody used. A brief exchange with a second vehicle. Dark blue Suburban. Cracked left taillight. Cole had seen that vehicle somewhere before. He couldn't place it yet. He rewound the footage, watched it again. Then he closed the laptop and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Someone inside his circle had opened the door for the people who tried to kill him. And somewhere in the building above him, a woman he didn't know the name of had left wildflowers with no card and walked away before anyone could see. He didn't know why he kept coming back to that. He just did. She had worked in his house for 4 years and he had never once asked her name. He had said thank you exactly 3 times, she had counted. Because when you're invisible, you count the small things. You hold on to them the way other people hold on to bigger things. Because they're all you get. He gave her Christmas bonuses on schedule. He never left a mess she wasn't expected to clean. He treated her the way people treat furniture they're fond of. Not badly, just without thinking. Ellie Morrow had decided a long time ago that in invisible she was starting to reconsider. Her alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. The apartment was small. It was always small. But it was clean, and she kept it that way the way you keep things when you can't afford for anything to go wrong. Jake's medical equipment sat in the corner of the living room where the second bedroom used to be. They'd converted it 18 months ago. They never talked about it. It was just the obvious thing, and neither of them was going to make it a whole conversation. She laid out Jake's medications in order before she did anything else, each bottle in its place. Then she left a note on the kitchen table because he slept late. Physical therapy at 11. It said, don't skip the pre-session stretches. There's food in the fridge. She texted the night nurses at County General to check on her mother's vitals. Then she did the math. The month's money against the month's bills. She did it every morning before she got out of bed. The math never worked. She did it anyway because the alternative was not knowing, and not knowing was worse. On the bus, she had a medical textbook open on her lap. 3rd chapter. She'd been on the same chapter for 2 weeks because she could only get through a few pages before her stop. The man next to her glanced at it. Med school, he said. Not anymore, she said. She went back to the page. He didn't ask anything else. She had given that answer enough times that it didn't require one. Cole came home in a wheelchair. Ellie had the room ready before he arrived. Fresh sheets in the thread count he preferred. Medications organized by schedule. Blackout curtains on the east-facing window because she'd looked up concussion protocol on her lunch break and implemented it without being asked. Nobody told her to do any of it. She was just that person. Vanessa arrived at 10. She stepped into the penthouse and scanned the room the way someone does when they're assessing a situation rather than entering one. Then she looked at the flowers on the entry table and said, without looking directly at Ellie, those need to go, white lilies in a sick room. She slid into the chair across from Cole and opened her phone. Darling, I've been talking to Martin about the board exposure. She did not ask how he slept. She did not ask if he was in pain. She said the board exposure. Ellie removed the flowers without any expression. She replaced them with deep red dahlias from the kitchen storage, which were not lilies, and went back to what she was doing. She noted it in the mental catalog she kept. She didn't judge it yet, she just filed it. Later in the afternoon, Cole dropped a book. It fell just past the reach of his wheelchair and landed open on the floor. He looked at it. Ellie passed through the doorway, picked it up without slowing down, set it on his armrest, and kept walking. No performance, no pause to see if he noticed. Cole said, "Thank you." He actually looked at her when he said it. That was different from the 2 times before. "You're welcome, sir," she said. She didn't look back. He sat there for a moment after she left. He thought about the calluses on her hands when she placed the book. The kind that come from years of real work, not from a gym. She hadn't performed the gesture. She had just done it, no eye contact check, no wait for acknowledgement. Just the action and then moving on. That evening, he found Marcus in the hallway. "What's her name?" Cole said. Marcus blinked. "Your housekeeper's, yes, Ellie Morrow. She's been here 4 years. I know how long she's been here." "Then why don't you know her name?" Cole didn't answer, because the answer was, "Because I didn't need to." And he was no longer willing to say that out loud. At 11 that night, the penthouse was quiet. The overnight security rotation was in place and everyone else was gone. Cole waited until the private hallway cameras showed clear. Then he stood up. He walked to the window. Stood there fully upright with his hands in the pockets of his gray shirt and looked at the city. The wheelchair was behind him. The performance was off. He was just a man looking at Chicago. On the other side of the wall, he could hear the kitchen. Very faint, running water. The soft knock of a cabinet closing. Footsteps moving from one task to the next. Steady and methodical. Ellie was finishing her last walkthrough. He listened without meaning to. The sounds were so ordinary. Water, a cabinet, footsteps. The sounds of someone doing their job with care at the end of a long day. With no audience and no applause. She was the only person in this building today, he thought, who hadn't performed a single thing. She just worked. He went back to the wheelchair before the hallway sensor re-engaged. In the staff room, Ellie changed out of her uniform. She reached into her coat pocket for her transit card and found something she hadn't put there. A folded index card. On it, in plain handwriting, was the name of a treatment protocol for stage 3 lung cancer. A newer one, with a citation from a Johns Hopkins oncology database update, last month. No note, just the reference. She stood holding it for a long moment. She took a photo of it with her phone and put the card carefully into the inside pocket of her jacket. She didn't know who left it. Marcus had reviewed the employee files when setting up the medical suite and had seen the emergency contact, the oncology ward at County General. That was enough for a man who paid attention to put 2 and 2 together. Ellie didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was this. Somebody in that building had noticed something about her life that she'd never told anyone there. And instead of using it, they'd done something about it. She filed it in the drawer where she kept the things she didn't know what to do with. On the bus home, she thought about what invisible actually meant. Wealthy people always assume the help can't see them, she thought. What they don't understand is that invisible has the best view in the house. You learn things about people when they stop performing for you. And they stop performing the moment they decide you don't count. She had always thought that was just an observation. She was beginning to think it might be something more complicated than that. Vanessa Drake had been beautiful her entire life. She had understood from a very early age that beauty was not a gift, it was a resource. Like capital, like credit. It required active management and a clear-eyed understanding of what it could and couldn't do. Her father Thomas had taught her that, not with words, with the way he lived. She had watched him spend 30 years converting loyalty into debt and love into leverage. She had decided at 16 that she would never be on the wrong side of that equation. She had succeeded completely. The only thing she hadn't accounted for was the possibility that being on the right side of the equation still left you alone at the end of the math. Her Gold Coast apartment. Phone call with Thomas in Boston. He asked about the Chicago situation in the careful way he had, every word chosen like he was testifying, which in a sense he always was. What they discussed, between the lines. Thomas had introduced her to Victor Rains a year ago. He had decided Cole's operation was worth more absorbed than allied with. Vanessa knew about the partnership discussions. She knew the broad shape of the plan. What she did not know was that Rains had organized the shooting. Thomas had told her it was a message, a pressure move. He told her Rains didn't operate that way, didn't go that far. She believed him. She was wrong about this. But she didn't know she was wrong. She sat by the window after the call ended and looked at the lake. She thought about Cole. She had felt something real for him early on. She was honest with herself about that, in the privacy of her own head where honesty cost nothing. It hadn't lasted, or rather, it had calcified, turned into something that looked like strategy because that was the only shape she knew how to hold things in. She had loved exactly one person in her life without any strategy at all, her sister Claire. Claire, who was funny and soft and couldn't figure out how to be hard. Not in the way their father required. Claire, who died of an overdose at 23 in the house, where Thomas Drake had spent decades teaching his daughters that emotion was weakness and need was currency. Vanessa had arranged the funeral with perfect composure. She had not cried, she had never forgiven herself for that. And she hadn't understood. Not for years, that she hadn't cried because she had been broken in exactly the same way Claire had been, just pointed in a different direction. She was not a monster, she was the product of one. That didn't make her less dangerous. But it made her more than she appeared to be. In both directions, she finished her coffee and went to the window. Below her, Chicago moved through its morning. She watched it without really seeing it. She had a role to play today. Back at the penthouse, Cole sat in his wheelchair by the window with his laptop open and did what he always did. He watched. The secondary camera system was still fully operational. The one Vanessa didn't know about, because his injury had conveniently taken out the visible system she was aware of. Cole had been careful about which system went down. At 11, Vanessa stepped onto the balcony with her phone. She chose the balcony because she knew about the study camera. She didn't know about the one mounted in the exterior light fixture. She had a careful conversation, no names. No direct statements, she said. The integration project is moving at the right pace. Our Midwest partner understands the timeline better than the original partners did. The current situation creates a window. We shouldn't manufacture urgency, but we also shouldn't waste the opening. Cole recorded it. He sent it to Marcus. Is this actionable? Marcus wrote back. It's enough to know. Not enough to move on, Cole replied. Then we wait. While Cole watched Vanessa manage her timeline, Ellie Morrow was in the supply closet on the 4th floor. It was the only room in the building where she could make a personal call without someone connected to Cole Harrington's world hearing it. She had figured that out in her first month. The insurance coordinator at County General was not good news. Jake's physical therapy coverage had hit its annual cap. 3 months early, because his case had been more complex than the original plan accounted for. The remaining sessions were out of pocket now. $3,200. Due by the end of the month, Ellie had $1,100 saved. She had been saving for 8 months toward a different number. She did the math twice. The second time didn't help. She didn't let herself cry, that wasn't a strength. It was just a thing she had learned to not do in places where crying didn't solve anything, which was most places. She made a list on the back of a receipt. The way you write when you're trying to look like someone who has a plan. Overtime available, she wrote. Weekend work, ask Mrs. Chen plasma donation Thursday. Cancel streaming. Talk to therapy clinic about payment plan. Ellie Morrow was 26 years old, and she was writing plasma donation on a receipt in a supply closet because her brother needed physical therapy that the insurance had run out on. Cole's secondary camera caught the supply closet door closing. Then 4 minutes of silence from that end of the hallway. He checked the monitor. He saw her, sitting on a bucket, head down, phone in one hand, writing on the back of something with the other. He watched. He didn't know what to do with what he was looking at. Not yet, but something moved in him. Deep down, under 20 years of being the kind of man who watched things and calculated them. Something shifted the way the ground shifts before anyone on the surface knows it's moving. He kept watching. That same afternoon, Cole's intelligence team sent him a report. A mid-level associate of his, Gerald Briggs, had been found dead that morning. Closed garage. Carbon, no forced entry. No signs of anything, ruled accidental. Cole had known Gerald for 11 years. Gerald was not a careless man. Gerald checked his parking structures and his garages the way careful people do. He had told Cole once that he'd watched too many movies where the bad thing happened in parking garages. Cole also knew that Gerald had eaten lunch 3 weeks ago with someone from Dean Calloway's network. His team had flagged it. He hadn't acted on it, he told Marcus. That wasn't an accident, Marcus. Can you prove it, Cole? No. Marcus, then what do you do with it? Cole, I know something I can't use yet. He added Jill's name to the list he was building in his head. It was getting longer. That evening, Ellie finished her walkthrough and passed the study. The door was open about 2 inches. Not unusual, she kept moving. Then she heard Vanessa's voice from inside, clear and flat. The current arrangement can't hold indefinitely. Once the restructuring paperwork moves through the right channels, the transition becomes automatic. It doesn't require anyone's active cooperation at that point. Ellie stopped moving. She set down the glass she was carrying. Silently, she stood there for a second. Restructuring paperwork, transition, automatic. She didn't know what she'd heard exactly, but she knew the tone. She had heard it before from a different person, in a different context. Her former landlord had spoken in exactly that voice 3 months before he evicted her entire floor. That same flat efficiency. The language of people who had already made a decision and were just managing the paperwork. She moved back down the hallway without a sound. She went home and called her best friend Tara. Tara worked double shifts at a grocery store on the west side. She had known Ellie since 5th grade. She was the most practical person Ellie had ever met, which meant she usually said the thing Ellie wasn't ready to hear. Ellie told her about the therapy cap. The 3,200, you need to find another job, Tara said. The rate at any other position won't cover Jake's therapy, so you're trapped. I'm not trapped. I have reasons, Ellie. Tara's voice was patient and tired. Listen to me. Being trapped with a good reason is still being trapped. The trap doesn't care why you walked into it. Ellie was quiet, she said finally. She knew she had known for a while. That was the thing nobody talked about. The thing that was harder than the money part. It wasn't just that she didn't have enough. It was that every choice she tried to make folded back into the same corner. Stay or go, the answer was stay. Because going cost Jake his therapy and her mother her routine visits and the whole careful structure she had built to keep things from falling apart. Freedom wasn't the absence of walls, she thought. Freedom was having enough options that you could afford to choose the harder one. She didn't have that, she never had. She had been trained, without anyone meaning to train her, to notice exactly the things that people in power forgot to hide. 4 years of working in other people's spaces. You develop a specific kind of attention. The angle of a phone screen held slightly away from a camera, a door left open by exactly 2 inches, which is different from a door left open by accident. The small ways people adjust their behavior when they think they're alone. Ellie Morrow noticed things. She had always been careful about what she did with what she noticed. On the morning of day 14, she stopped being careful. It started with the slippers. Cole wore the same pair every morning, navy blue, leather-soled. She had cleaned around them for 2 weeks. That morning, she picked them up off the bathroom floor and turned them over, even wear on both soles symmetric. The kind of wear pattern that only happens when someone shifts their weight equally between both feet, which is not physically possible for someone with no motor function below the waist. She set the slippers down. Then she thought about the security door at the end of the private hallway. She had cleaned around that door for 4 years. She knew it well. It had a retinal scanner that required the user to stand at a very specific height for the sensor to register. She had watched the building's IT staff calibrate it twice. It could not be operated from a seated position. That door had been used twice in the past week. Both times, Cole had been alone in the hallway. The third thing was a conversation she hadn't meant to hear. Marcus and Cole, around the corner from the kitchen. Marcus saying in a low voice, "Your physical recovery is ahead of the projected schedule. Not the schedule for a real recovery, the projected schedule for a fake one." She put the 3 things together. Stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the counter. Then she went and found Marcus in the back hallway by the service elevator. She asked him directly, no theater, no build-up. She just said what she thought she knew and waited. Marcus didn't confirm it. He also didn't deny it. His face did everything his mouth didn't. She walked back to the staff room. She didn't know why Cole was faking it. Insurance fraud, maybe. Board manipulation. Some financial move she didn't understand. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she had been in that building for 4 years. And she had been in that building every day for 2 weeks of a lie. And the lie included her. The lie required her. She had been serving it with her best work, and she hadn't known. That felt worse than anger. It was the kind of feeling that doesn't have a clean name. She sat down at the small desk in the corner of the staff room and wrote a resignation letter, professional 4 sentences. She signed it. She sealed it in an envelope from the desk drawer. She put on her coat. She was about to stand up when her phone rang. County General. A nurse she recognized from her mother's ward. She answered. Jake had developed a secondary complication. A spinal pressure issue that the original surgical team had missed in the accident assessment. Not immediately life-threatening. But it needed intervention from a specialist clinic within the next 30 days. If they waited longer than that, the window closed. The clinic required $40,000 up front before beginning the treatment series. Ellie asked the nurse to repeat the number. She had heard it right. Her bank balance that morning was $1,847. She had checked before she left the apartment, because she always checked before she left the apartment. She sat on the bench in the staff room with the phone in her hand and the sealed envelope in the other. She sat there for 6 minutes without moving. The clock on the wall ticked. The ventilation hummed. Outside in the hallway, someone's cartwheel squeaked past. Here's the thing about being poor that people who have never been poor don't fully understand. It's not about the number. The number is just the surface of it. The deeper thing is what the number does to your choices. When you have enough money, you get to be principled. You get to say this is wrong and I'm going to leave. You get to choose the harder thing because you can absorb the cost. When you don't have it, every decision branches the same way. Not should I stay or go, but if I go, what happens to Jake? Not should I speak or be quiet. But if I speak, where does the rent come from? Freedom is not the absence of walls. Freedom is having enough alternatives that you can afford to choose the hard one. Ellie Morrow did not have that. She had exactly one option. And it was to put the sealed envelope in her coat pocket instead of on the administrator's desk, and go back upstairs and work. She put the letter in her pocket. She went upstairs. She set Cole's afternoon tea on the side table with exactly the same precision and care she always used. Saucer straight, spoon at 3 o'clock. The edge of the tray parallel with the edge of the table. She felt nothing. She had practice at that. Cole was across the room when she set the tray down. He didn't look up from his laptop, but he noticed. She had forgotten to straighten the saucer. She always straightened the saucer. He waited until she left the room. Then he called Marcus in. Something happened to Ellie, he said. Marcus looked at him. How do you know? The saucer, Marcus stared. Run a background check on her family. Medical and financial, full picture. Cole, I'm not collecting information to use against her, Cole said. I'm collecting it to understand her. Those are two different things. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's new for you, he said. I know. Marcus came back with the records that evening. Cole reviewed them alone. The desk lamp was the only light in the room. Ruth Morrow, stage 3 lung cancer. 2 years of treatment at County General. The bills were long and the insurance gaps were longer. Jake Morrow, 16 years old. Spinal injury from a car accident. The accident report included one line Cole read twice. The father had also been in the vehicle. The father had not survived. And then the new document at the top. Today's assessment, the specialist clinic. $40,000 due before treatment could begin. Ellie's savings, according to her bank records. $1,847. Cole sat with that for a while. He thought about the woman sitting on a bucket in a supply closet with a receipt in her hand, writing plasma donation like it was just another item on a to-do list. He thought about the sealed letter she'd written. He thought about what it cost to put that letter in her pocket and go back upstairs and do her job with the same care she always used. He picked up the phone. He called Preston Medical, the specialist clinic, through a foundation account his attorney had set up years ago for exactly these situations. The kind of account with no direct connection to the Harrington name. The payment cleared before midnight. Jake was scheduled for Monday. He put the phone down. He didn't tell Marcus. He didn't tell anyone. He sat in the dark office for a long time. He was not one who examined his own motivations closely. He had found that to be an uncomfortable practice. But he sat there and let himself feel the thing he was feeling, which was something close to shame and something close to something else he didn't have a word for yet. The next morning, Ellie came in and moved differently. Not noticeably if you weren't looking. The work was the same. The precision was the same. But the particular weight she'd been carrying the day before was gone. Something had shifted in the night, and she didn't know how or why. She filed it in the drawer. The drawer was getting full. Cole's security team found the resignation letter at the end of the day. Standard protocol. All discarded documents from the household were reviewed. His security chief but brought it to the morning briefing the next day, handed it across the desk. Cole read it once, then he read it again. He took it from the briefing folder. He put it in the locked drawer of his desk. He said nothing. He fired no one, he didn't mention it, but he had not in his adult life held on to something that someone tried to throw away. He had never thought to. That evening, Ellie took the bus to County General. The shared ward, 4 beds, faded curtains between them, heart monitors beeping their slow rhythms. Her mother, Ruth, had been an ER nurse for 22 years. She had very specific opinions about hospital wards and the people running them, and she expressed them freely. She took one look at Ellie sitting down next to the bed and said, "When did you last eat a real meal?" "Mom, I'm not asking to make you feel bad. I'm asking as a nurse. You look like someone 3 days into a double shift with no breaks." Ellie tried to redirect the conversation. Ruth didn't let her. "I need to say something to you, and I need you to actually hear it." Ruth's voice was quiet, but it had always been the kind of quiet that filled a room. "My illness is not a math problem for you to solve. I know that's what you're doing. I know you run the numbers every morning before you get out of bed. But I spent 22 years watching what happens to caregivers who don't take care of themselves. You cannot pour from something empty." "I'm fine," he said. "You're functional," Ruth said. "Those are not the same thing, and you know it." She reached out and took Ellie's hand. "A person can have dignity and still be exhausted. That's not a contradiction. I raised you to know the difference. I need to know you still do." Ellie drove home in silence. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket, still sealed. She thought about the saucer she'd forgotten to straighten. She thought about a man who asked her name 4 years too late and didn't say why. She thought about her mother's hands, which had spent 22 years fixing and were now the ones with an IV line taped to them, thin under the fluorescent lights. She parked on her street. She sat in the car for a minute before going in. Dignity and exhaustion, she thought. Not a contradiction. She didn't know yet if she believed it, but she went inside. She made Jake's dinner. She checked the hospital website for updated information on the treatment protocol the index card had referenced. She did the math again. It still didn't work. She did it anyway. There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs to people who are surrounded by everyone who wants something from them. Cole Harrington had lived in that loneliness for so long he had stopped recognizing it. The way you stop hearing highway noise when you've lived near one long enough. The sound becomes part of the air. You only notice it when it stops. It took a woman who wanted nothing from him to make him hear the silence again, not by being kind, by being honest, which in his world turned out to be the same thing. The financial advisor called at 2 in the afternoon. Cole took the call from the wheelchair, which he always did when anyone else was in the building. The advisor was recommending a property acquisition on the west side. Commercial space with a zoning variance attached. He presented it the way advisors present things they've already decided on, confident. A little too smooth. Ellie passed through the far edge of the room with fresh linens. She wasn't trying to be seen. She was moving from the linen closet to the guest bedroom, the way she moved through every room, efficient, quiet, taking up as little space as possible. But Cole caught it, a micro-expression. A brief tightening around her eyes as the advisor spoke. The face of someone who has just heard something that doesn't add up and is deciding whether to say so. She was gone before the call ended. Cole hung up Ellie. She stopped in the hallway, turned. Professional, waiting. The property he recommended. Cole said, "You made a face." "I didn't. I notice faces." She was quiet for a moment, working something out. "I didn't hear the whole conversation," she said. "You heard enough. What did you think?" A longer pause. He watched her decide. "The zoning variance isn't a formality," she said finally. "That site has had variance applications fail twice in the last 12 years. It's public record, if it fails again. You're sitting on a $6 million anchor with no revenue offset for 18 months minimum. It's a bad deal with a good-sounding presentation." Cole looked at her. "How do you know zoning variance history on a West Side commercial property?" "Pre-med requires economics coursework," she said. "And I read things. The city planning database is free." He called the advisor back after she left. Declined the acquisition. His own analysts had reviewed the deal and cleared it. 3 people with advanced degrees and access to proprietary data. The woman who managed his household caught what they missed by reading the free public record on her own time. He sat with that for a while. He had been looking in entirely the wrong places for clarity. He was beginning to understand this. The library was at the end of the private hallway. Cole's mother Margaret had filled it over 30 years. Medical texts, history, literature. The medical shelf got touched sometimes. He could tell because the spines shifted between her cleaning days. He didn't know who was reading them. That afternoon he wheeled past the open door and found out. Ellie was on the floor, cross-legged, a Johns Hopkins entity text open in her lap, her finger tracing a passage in the way people read when reading is not casual for them, when every word matters. She didn't hear him stop. He watched her for a moment. "That was my mother's," he said. She startled, nearly dropped the book. The apology rose in her face immediately. He cut it off. She wanted to be a doctor. Didn't get there. My father's world didn't leave room for it. Ellie held the book carefully, like it had become something different now that she knew whose name was in it. "I'm sorry," she said. "What happened to your path?" She was quiet for a second. "Family got sick. Money ran out. In that order." "How close were you?" "Second year." "Top of my class." She closed the book, set it back exactly where she'd found it. "I had a professor who said I had the best diagnostic intuition she'd seen in 10 years of teaching." She probably wasn't being generous. She probably was. She probably wasn't. Cole said again, between them, not uncomfortable. Two people in a dusty room full of a dead woman's unrealized ambitions. Recognizing something without naming it. "You can read them," Cole said. "Any of them. On your breaks." "That's not, I know it's not necessary." "I said you can." She nodded once and left. He stayed in the doorway for a moment after she was gone, looking at the shelf, at the spine of the anatomy text she had put back in exactly the right place. Late that night, he was in the study going through surveillance reports. The building was quiet. Everyone gone except the overnight rotation. Then he heard it, from the kitchen. Very faint. Ellie finishing her last walkthrough. Singing quietly to herself, something old and low. The kind of song you sing when you have completely forgotten that anyone might hear you. When you've been alone for so long that alone feels like the default. She stopped the moment she registered the study light under the door. The kitchen went silent. Cole didn't move. He turned back to the reports. He read the same paragraph 4 times over the next 3 minutes and could not have told you a single word of it. The next day, Dean Calloway came in for an operational review. Dean was good. He had been good for 6 years, which was part of why this was hard to see. He performed concern well. He performed loyalty well. He asked the right questions in the right tone. Ellie was working in the adjacent office while Dean met with Cole in the study. What Dean asked specifically was about the secondary security system. How the medical monitoring setup interfaced with the building's emergency override. Whether the backup alert system had a manual disable function. He framed it as contingency planning, in case Cole had a medical episode, which, given the cover story, was a reasonable thing for a concerned right-hand man to think about. Except Ellie had cleaned around every wire and panel in this building for 4 years. She knew what the secondary system did. She knew what it didn't do. And she knew the difference between questions about emergency access and questions about neutralization. It was a specific difference. The kind you could only know if you understood what the system was actually built to prevent. Dean's questions were not about getting help to Cole in an emergency. They were about making sure help couldn't reach him at all. She didn't know what to do with that. She kept working. She finished the office. She went home. She was pulling onto her street when she thought about what she'd heard and what she actually knew about it. She knew enough to know it was wrong. She didn't know enough to know what wrong meant in this context. 2 days later, Cole received an envelope at the building's concierge desk. No return address, no postage, which meant it had been hand-delivered. Inside was a photograph, single image, taken with a long lens from across the street. It showed Ellie walking north on Michigan Avenue at 9:17 on a Tuesday evening. She was alone. She was wearing her old coat with the fraying collar, moving at the pace of someone who has a long walk ahead and has done it enough times not to think about it. She had no idea anyone was watching. No note. No words of any kind. Just the photograph. Cole looked at it for a long time. He called his intelligence chief and asked him to trace the lens signature. Then he called Marcus. "Rains knows I'm watching him," he said. "He's showing me he can look in the same direction." Marcus was quiet. "He's telling you he knows about her." Yes, what are you going to do? Not give him the reaction he's looking for, but I need to move faster. He put the photograph in the locked drawer, on top of Ellie's resignation letter. The drawer was getting full of things that mattered. That same evening, Cole was in the study reviewing footage from the night of the shooting, the raw secondary feed. He was looking for anything he'd missed. Ellie passed the doorway with a tray. She saw the monitor, the restaurant exterior, the SUV, the immediate aftermath visible at the edge of the frame. She stopped. Set the tray on the hallway console. Cole, you don't have to look at that. Ellie looked at the screen for a moment. Then at him, I've seen worse, she said, hospital intake. Flu season car accident patients. A pause. Are you okay from that night? Actually, he had been asked that question many times in the past weeks. Nobody had meant the word actually before. He felt the difference land somewhere in his chest. I will be, she nodded, picked up the tray, walked on down the hallway. He turned back to the monitor. He had completely lost the thread of what he was looking for on a Wednesday afternoon, while Ellie was at work and Cole was in the penthouse. Jake Morrow was alone in the apartment on the south side. He rolled himself to the bookshelf in the living room, the one Ellie had reorganized last month. He found her anatomy textbook on the second shelf, the one she worked through on the bus. A few pages at a time, he opened it to her bookmark. He started reading, he didn't realize, until he was 3 paragraphs in, that he was reading about spinal cord injury classifications. The clinical language, the names for the different kinds of damage, the mechanisms, the documented ranges of outcomes. He kept reading anyway. There was something about seeing it written that way. Clean and factual. No pity in it, no tragedy framing. Just the anatomy of what had happened to him. Organized and named and placed inside a literature that had existed long before him and would exist long after. His situation was not a mystery, it was not a punishment. It was a medical condition with a documented set of known possibilities. That was different from how he usually thought about it. He sat with the book for a long time, then he closed it, put it back exactly as Ellie had left it. Went back to the window. When Ellie got home that evening, she could tell he'd touched it. The bookmark was at the same page, but the angle of the book was slightly different. She had a sense for how she left things. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. They ate dinner and watched a show and went to bed, and neither of them mentioned it. But she noticed him sitting a little straighter that night. Like something had settled inside him. Like having a name for a thing, even a hard thing, was better than the thing being nameless. It probably was. That night Ellie was leaving at 9. Cole was lit, door open a few inches. She heard him before she reached the elevator, not on the phone. Not talking to Marcus, he was speaking quietly to the framed photograph of his mother on the desk. Margaret Harrington smiling in a garden somewhere. The photo old enough to have gone slightly warm at the edges. I know, Mom, he was saying. I know I've stayed too long in the wrong things. I'm starting to see it, a pause. She reminds me of you, actually. She pretends she doesn't need anything. And then you catch her when she forgets to pretend. Ellie walked away fast. Her hand was pressed flat against her sternum like she was trying to hold something in. She stood at the elevator and waited for it to come. The numbers above the door counted down. She stared at them, she filed it in the drawer. The drawer was almost full. Loyalty, Cole Harrington had learned from watching his father, was a business arrangement in emotional packaging. You rewarded it when it served you. You replaced it when it didn't. That model had worked for 20 years. It had built an empire and staffed it and kept it running. It had also, he was beginning to understand, produced a system where the only person in his building who was actually loyal in the older sense of the word, the kind that didn't require calculation, was the one he had never once thought to look at. Ellie went back to the adjacent office after Dean's visit to finish the cleaning she'd started before his operational review. Dean had left. Cole was in the study with Marcus going over schedules. She was wiping down the credenza when she noticed the folder. Dean had left it on the side table. Not entirely closed. The kind of not closed that looked like an accident but required a specific kind of carelessness that didn't match everything else she knew about Dean Calloway. She looked at it for a moment. Under the top folder, partially visible, was a printed schematic. She could see enough of it to recognize the layout, the penthouse's HVAC and electrical systems, the integration points with the medical monitoring setup, 2 locations circled in pencil. She stood there. She could close the folder and keep cleaning. That was the correct thing to do. That was the job. That was staying in the lane she'd been told she belonged in. She photographed the page with her phone. She closed the folder, finished the credenza, moved to the next thing, did the rest of her shift the same way she always did it, which was carefully and without calling attention to herself. She went home. At 11, she texted Marcus. I need to send you something. I don't know what I'm looking at, but I think you might. She sent the photo. Marcus called Cole at 11:08. Cole looked at the schematic for a long time without speaking. She sent this to you, he said. She said she didn't know what she was looking at. She knew exactly what she was looking at. He set the phone down. She had exposed herself. She had shown that she'd been paying closer attention than her position allowed for. She had crossed the line between housekeeper and person who gets involved. And in his world that line existed for a reason and she knew it. She crossed it anyway, to give him information that might matter. Cole had spent 20 years watching people make calculations. He was very good at identifying the moment a person decided what something was worth to them and acted accordingly. What Ellie had done was not a calculation. It was something else. This was the moment he stopped observing her and started seeing her. The difference was bigger than he had expected. Vanessa arranged a dinner 2 days later. Her guest list, her framing. She presented it to Cole as visibility. The associates needed to see stability. An engagement announcement at the right moment would send the right signal. Cole, whose signal Vanessa. Ours our alliance, not our relationship. Their alliance, 12 people came. Business associates, a couple of family-adjacent contacts, one attorney. The dining room was arranged the way Vanessa arranged rooms, which was with the precision of someone staging a scene rather than hosting a meal. Ellie served. She did it the way she did everything. Quietly and well, Vanessa spoke to her the way she always did, which was the way you address something useful that occasionally gets in your way. An hour into the dinner, Cole said, without raising his voice, Ellie, come sit for a moment. The table went slightly still. Vanessa's smile stayed in place. It was a good smile, only her glass hand gave anything away, tightening once before she made it stop. Cole to the table. She's been on her feet since 7 this morning. She can sit for a few minutes. Nobody argued. Nobody quite knew what to do with it. Ellie sat at the end of the table for 6 minutes, back straight, hands folded, saying nothing unless directly addressed. She spoke once to answer a question from the attorney about something completely unrelated to why she was there. Then Cole said she could get back to it, and she did. Later, in the kitchen, washing the first round of dishes at 11 o'clock at night, she thought about those 6 minutes. He had called her by name. In front of all of them, he had asked her to sit like she was a person who had been standing for 16 hours, which she was, and which nobody had noticed before him. She had a drawer in her head where she kept the things she didn't know what to do with. That drawer was full after the guests left. Cole called Dean into the study. Just the two of them. Cole was in the wheelchair, which was deliberate. He wanted Dean looking down at him. He wanted Dean to feel the familiar shape of the power arrangement before he changed it. He opened the desk drawer and slid a single printed page across the surface. The schematic Ellie had photographed. Below it, a second document. An annotated log of Dean's calls over the past 3 weeks. Timestamps, the correlations to the planning timeline of the assassination attempt, marked in a different color. Cole didn't say anything. He just looked at Dean. Dean looked at the documents. He was very good. He deployed his composure fully, the way a professional does when the professional move is composure. But Cole had spent 20 years reading men in pressure situations. He watched Dean's left hand find the armrest of the chair and hold it, just once. Just for a second. That was enough. Your desk at the secondary office on Fulton has been ready for 2 weeks, Cole said. Your key card will work there starting tomorrow morning. He took the documents back. Take whatever you need from here tonight. Dean said his name. Don't, Cole said. Don't say anything that requires me to decide what to do with it right now. Dean stood, straightened his jacket. He had always been a neat dresser. He walked to the door. At the door, without turning around. How long have you known? Long enough, Cole said. Dean left. Cole sat in the quiet after the footsteps faded. He knew Dean would call Rains within the hour. He had accounted for that. He knew it accelerated the timeline. He had accounted for that too. What he had not accounted for was the feeling sitting in the room with him after Dean was gone, something undefended, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The information that had moved him to act tonight had come from a woman who had everything to lose by sending it and had sent it anyway, not for money, not for position, because it seemed like the right thing to do. He didn't have a framework for that. He was going to need to build one. Ellie told Tara about the schematic that night. Vaguely, she left out most of the specifics. Tara, you sent it to his doctor. Why not just leave it where it was? Ellie, because leaving it doesn't guarantee he sees it. Tara, and now someone knows you were paying attention to things above your pay grade. Ellie, I know, Tara, that's how people like that end up treating people like you as problems. You stop being invisible and you become a liability. Ellie, Jake said the same thing. Tara, Jake's smart. Ellie, I know that too. She knew. She had known when she took the photo. That was the thing she hadn't told Tara. She had taken the photo knowing full well what it made her. Not invisible anymore. Not safely in the background. A person who had seen something and done something about it, which in that world was the same as stepping into the open. It was a choice, she had made it anyway. People in positions like hers got called things when they made choices like that. Difficult, overstepping problems. They got managed, which was the polite word for what happened when powerful people decided you had become inconvenient. She knew all of that. She had done it anyway, because the alternative was knowing something that mattered and saying nothing, and she was not built for that. Her mother hadn't raised her to be built for that. Dignity, her mother had told her once, is what you do when nobody's watching and nobody will ever know. It's not the big visible thing. It's the small private thing. Every time, Ellie had taken the photo. At 11:30 her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go. Hello, Dean Kelly has been relocated to the Fulton office. Cole's voice. Careful. He won't be returning to this building. Silence, and why are you telling me this, she said. Because he was a threat to you specifically and now he isn't. She didn't say anything for a moment. Is everything okay? She said finally. It will be good. She almost hung up. Then Mr. Cole. A longer pause. Get some sleep, he said. You've had a long week. He hung up first. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment after. He had wanted to say something else. He didn't know what. That was new for him, too. He was usually very clear on what he wanted to say. He put the phone down and went back to the reports. He read the same line 3 times before he gave up and closed the laptop. She had started to breathe again. That was her first mistake. In the world Cole Harrington inhabited, breathing was something you did in the spaces between emergencies. The emergencies themselves did not check your schedule or ask if you were ready. The morning after Dean's relocation, the penthouse felt different. Something had been removed from it. A particular kind of weight that Ellie hadn't fully named until it was gone. Cole was different too, not dramatically. He didn't suddenly become someone else. But there was a quality of presence in him now that hadn't been there before. Something less defended. He asked her at breakfast what she was currently reading. He listened to the answer. He asked a follow-up question. He had never asked a follow-up question before. She let herself feel something about that. Not certainty, nothing as solid as certainty. Just permission. Permission to wonder about something other than survival. She told herself to be careful. She was not careful enough. That evening she sat down in the library on her break with a chapter of Margaret Harrington's anatomy text, and didn't come back. She fell asleep in the armchair, book open in her lap. Head tilted slightly forward, the lamp warm on her face. Cole found her at 7. He stopped in the doorway, stood there a moment. He went to the hallway closet, retrieved his jacket. He told himself he'd been meaning to get it anyway. He went back to the library and laid it over her shoulders. He sat in the chair across from her and opened his operational reports. 20 minutes later she woke up, disoriented, the lamp, the book, the jacket around her shoulders. Then she saw him across the room, reading, like this was a completely normal arrangement. I'm sorry, she started. You needed 20 minutes, he said. He went back to his reading. She picked up her book. They sat in the library for another 10 minutes before she got up to finish her walkthrough. Neither of them said anything about the jacket. Neither of them said anything about the fact that they had just shared a room like 2 people who were allowed to share a room. It was the first time since she'd started working there that she didn't feel like furniture in one of his spaces. She should have known better than to let herself feel that. The next morning at noon, Ellie's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. A reporter from a tabloid she'd seen on checkout stands. He asked if she was Ellie Morrow. the housekeeper employed by Cole Harrington at Harrington Tower. She hung up without answering. Within an hour, the story was live. Cole Harrington had staged a fake disability. The story said, evidence of insurance fraud, evidence of board manipulation, security footage, edited and stripped of context, showing Cole on his feet when he was supposed to be in a wheelchair. And in paragraph 4, the housekeeper, Ellie Morrow, named as Cole's inside source, the woman who had fed him intelligence from inside the building. There were two interpretations offered. Either she was being used without her knowledge, or she had cooperated fully. The story was constructed so that either reading made her responsible. Her name, her face, pulled from somewhere she didn't know. Maybe her employment records, maybe somewhere else. By noon, it was everywhere. Cole in the study with Marcus when the alert came through. Very still, not the stillness of shock. The stillness of a man running through every implication at once. Marcus, this is Vanessa, Cole. I know, he called his attorney. He called his intelligence chief. He called 3 people in quick succession and spoke to each of them in a voice Marcus had heard before. The one Cole used when the consequence of losing control was too high. Then he stopped, because the damage was already moving, and it was not moving toward him. Within 4 hours, the clinic treating Jake received a compliance alert. A Harrington-connected foundation account had been flagged mid-scandal. The clinic's legal department put a hold on all billing under that account pending review. The timeline for resolution, unknown. Jake's treatment had been going well. 3 weeks in, the specialist was cautiously optimistic. That stopped. Ellie's phone rang again. A different number. The physical therapy clinic that managed Jake's ongoing sessions. Given the press coverage linking you to organized crime activity, the coordinator said carefully, we've had to suspend Jake's sessions pending review. We understand this is difficult, Ellie said. She understood and hung up. She stood in the staff bathroom with the phone in her hand, her name in a story she'd had no part in writing. Jake's treatment on hold, and she had not yet gotten the third call, which came the next morning. She arrived at Harrington Tower at 6:55 a.m. Mitchell was in the lobby, the head of building security. He was not an unkind man. He had always been professional with her. All household staff are on administrative suspension pending the internal security review, he said. You'll be contacted when the investigation concludes. I didn't breach anything, Ellie said. Morrow. I understand I have worked in this building for 4 years, and I have my orders. Mitchell said quietly, I'm sorry. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked back out of the building. In less than 24 hours. Her name was in a story she hadn't created. Jake's treatment was suspended. She had no income and her name was now attached, in the specific communities where this kind of thing had permanent weight, to organized crime activity. It would follow her on job applications. It would follow her in her neighborhood. It would follow Jake, who was 16 years old and had nothing to do with any of it. She drove home. Jake was at the window when she came in. He turned his chair toward her. He didn't ask what happened. The look on her face was the answer. He wheeled to her. He couldn't stand to hold her, so he reached out and took her hand instead, both of his hands around hers. She sat down on the floor beside his chair, back against it, their hands linked between them. For the first time in years. Not months, but years. Ellie Morrow stopped holding everything up. Not gracefully, not quietly. The way a structure finally comes apart when one wall has been carrying too much for too long and the weight shifts past the limit. Jake didn't say anything. He held her hand and let it happen because he knew better than to try to stop it. When it passed, she wiped her face with her sleeve. They sat in the quiet of the apartment. The medical equipment humming in the corner. The late morning light coming through the window. Okay, she said. Jake said. Yeah, what do we do? I don't know yet. She said it out loud. That's the first time I've said that in a while. I know, he said. When she was steadier, she told him what had happened. All of it. He listened the way he always listened, with that particular quality of attention that made him seem older than 16 and younger at the same time. They put my name in a story like I'm a prop, she said, like I don't have a family and a life. Like the actual details of my life are just texture in somebody else's narrative. To them they are, Jake said. That's wrong. Yeah, it's wrong in a way that's bigger than just me. Every person who's ever been invisible until they became inconvenient. Every person who got their name used without their permission because someone powerful needed a role filled. That's wrong every single time it happens. not just when it happens to us. Jake looked at her. You sound like you're writing an op-ed. Maybe I should. Maybe you should. Not quite, but close. Cole found out what Mitchell had done within the hour. He was on the phone with Mitchell before the morning was half over. Call her, reinstate her now. Sir Protocol required call her. Now Mitchell called Ellie. She stared at her phone when it rang. She let it go to voicemail. She called back an hour later, not to Mitchell's direct line. She called the building's main number and asked to be connected to Mitchell. Tell Mr. Harrington, she said, that I'll come back when he calls me himself, not through an intermediary. Mitchell delivered this. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus, who was in the room, said, "What's funny, Cole?" "Nothing. Marcus, you're smiling." "Cole, get me her number," he called her directly. She answered on the second ring. "I'm sorry," he said, silence. "For which part?" she said. "All of it. Your name in the story. Jake's treatment, the job. Your name being attached to any of this. All of it." A long pause. "Can you fix it?" she said. "Some of it, yes. The treatment hold, and the job. Yes, your name being in the story. I can push back, but I can't make it disappear. Don't promise me anything about the rest yet." "Okay." Another pause. Shorter. "I'll be in at 7 tomorrow," she said. She hung up first. "Marcus, she hung up on you." "Cole's Marcus, nobody hangs up on you." "Cole, she just did." Marcus looked at him. "And you're smiling again." "Cole, no, I'm not, Marcus." "A little bit." Cole didn't answer. But Marcus was right, he was. An apology is only the opening of a sentence. What comes after it is the only part that carries any weight. Ellie Morrow had received enough apologies in her life to know the difference. From her father before he left. From landlords before they raised the rent. From systems that promised to work and didn't. She knew the kind that ended things and the kind that started them. Cole Harrington, for the first time she could recall, seemed to understand he was still standing at the comma. She came back at 7 the next morning. The penthouse felt different. Vanessa's things were gone. The engagement flowers from the entry table were gone. Even the air had changed somehow. Like a room after a window has been opened for the first time in years. Cole was in the living room when she arrived. In the wheelchair then, when it was clear they were alone, he stood up, he walked to the window. Didn't explain it, didn't preface it. Just stood there with his hands at his sides, looking out at the city. "How long?" Ellie said. "Since I came home. I was shot in the shoulder and grazed along the ribs. The paralysis was never real." "Why?" He told her everything. Not a version of it, not the edited version he might have given someone he was managing. All of it. The assassination attempt, the deleted footage, the mole hunt, the surveillance on Vanessa, which had never been primarily about testing her feelings but about identifying a security threat. Dean. The schematic she had photographed. Victor Rains. The photograph of her walking home that had arrived in an unmarked envelope. He told her about watching her in the supply closet with the receipt in her hand. He told her about the resignation letter in his locked drawer. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The anonymous foundation payment," she said. "Jake's emergency treatment." Cole said nothing. "My mother's protocol card, nothing. The treatment hold that cleared overnight after I was reinstated. Still nothing. How long have you been watching my family?" "Since I found out about Jake's complication." "Why didn't you just tell me?" He was quiet, not the strategic quiet she had seen from him in the early weeks. "Something more honest than that." "Because I didn't know how to be the person who told you," he said. "I only knew how to be the person who handled it." Ellie looked at him for a long moment. "That's the problem with power," she said. "It trains you to think that handling something is the same as being honest about it. You fixed Jake's care, you fixed my mother's treatment. And those things mattered. They genuinely mattered. But you did it the way someone manages a situation, not the way someone respects another person. What's the difference? One treats me like a problem with a solution. The other treats me like a human being who gets to know what's happening in her own life." He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. "I hear that," he said. "Do you?" "Yes. I substituted management for honesty because management is what I know. Honesty requires something I've spent 20 years making sure I never had to give anyone." "What's that?" "An explanation. I engineered my life so I never owed one." The room was quiet. "At least you can name it," she said. "That's a low bar." "It's a start." She looked at him directly then, the way she almost never had before. "There's something else I need to say." "Say it. You could fix my family's entire situation with one phone call. My mother's care, Jake's surgery, My school. One call. That's not a relationship. That's ownership with better manners. I know. So what is it you actually want? From me, say it specifically. He took his time, she waited. I want someone who tells me the truth without calculating what it costs them first. I've spent 20 years reading people's intentions, and I've been completely blind to actual people. A pause. You're the first person in this building who behaved exactly the same way whether or not anyone was watching. I want to know someone like that. I want to be worth knowing by someone like that. That's not a small ask, no. And I'm still your employee. That can change. Then change it, properly. Notice period, reference letter, final paycheck, severance. And then ask me for coffee. Okay, she said okay back. Then she stood up and reached for her cleaning supplies by pure reflex. Stopped, set them back down. I'll finish the week. I'll take the second week as paid notice. At the door she turned. In 4 years, I've seen a lot of who you are when nobody important is watching. There's more worth keeping than you seem to know. A pause. That's not a promise about coffee. I'm just telling you the truth. Since we're doing that now, she left. On the bus home, she took out her phone. She looked up Northwestern's re-enrollment process. She didn't fill anything out. She just looked at it. Then she looked at Jake's latest therapy notes, the cautious optimism from before the hold. She let herself carefully and briefly imagine something different. She told herself not to build too much on it. She built a little anyway. 2 days later, Cole's operations manager ran the daily security review. A face in the lobby feed. Low level, tagged in an old intelligence file as connected to Raines's network. The operative hadn't been asking for Cole, hadn't been attempting access. He had asked the front desk coordinator what time the housekeeper on Cole's floor usually finished her shift. Cole read the alert. He called Marcus. Find out if Ellie is working late today. Marcus, why? Because someone asked. Victor Raines had one principle that had served him for 30 years. You don't attack a man's empire. Empires have walls and lawyers and contingency plans. You attack what a man can't defend. You attack what he just discovered he loves. Because that wall is always the newest one, which means it's always the weakest. Raines had spent 3 weeks figuring out what Cole Harrington had just discovered he loved. He had his answer. His move came without a single act of physical violence. He used a banking contact to flag the Harrington Foundation accounts for compliance review. Technically required given the press coverage, entirely legal. The accounts weren't frozen. They were suspended pending review, which was the legal system's version of the same thing. Jake's treatment account cleared 0. The clinic called Ellie. Suspended pending resolution. Timeline unknown. Then the surgeon called. His hospital's legal department had instructed him to pause all procedures connected to Harrington-associated cases until the fraud investigation was resolved. He was apologetic. He was professional. He could not do the surgery. Jake's surgical window with this specific surgeon closed in 30 days. The federal compliance referral arrived at the U.S. Attorney's office the same afternoon, real documentation. 8 months of it, gathered by Dean. Not an inquiry. The kind that means every phone call requires an attorney present and every movement becomes a liability. Cole received all 3 pieces of news within 4 hours. He drove to Ellie's apartment himself, the old household Toyota. Not the Maybach. He had been to the South Side before. He had not been to this street. He stood in the doorway of her apartment and took it in. The medical equipment in the corner. Jake's medications on the kitchen counter, organized in the same graduated system Ellie used for Cole's medications in the penthouse. Her anatomy textbook on the table with color-coded notes in the margins. The photograph of Ruth on the wall, from before the diagnosis. Some smiling at outside the frame. The careful arrangements of someone who had been making the most of limited space for so long it had become its own kind of art. He sat on the couch across from Ellie. Jake was at the window. I need to tell you what Raines did, Cole said, and how I'm going to respond. Okay, Jake's surgery. The account freeze. All of it is him. It's a pressure campaign. He wants me to choose between protecting the empire and protecting the people around me. Which are you going to choose? The longest pause in the conversation. I'm not going to fight it the way he expects me to. Then his phone rang. His attorney, the federal documents request had expanded. 4 years of records, full cooperation required, no parallel operations. Then another call. His intelligence chief. The surgeon's hospital had received a secondary compliance notice. also from Rains, that specifically named pending procedures connected to Harrington Associates. Minimum 60 days to resolve through legal channels. Jake's window closed in 30. Then the third call came, except it wasn't to Cole. Ellie's phone rang, a number she didn't know, she answered. Ms. Morrow, my name is Arthur Harrington. She knew who he was. Arthur spoke carefully, the way he did everything. He had spoken with Rains. There was an offer. It resolved everything affecting her family within 30 days. Jake's surgery, Ruth's care, Ellie's own situation. All of it cleared, in exchange for Cole stepping back from operations. If you care about him, Arthur said. And I believe you do. A person who loves someone sometimes has to help them make the choice they won't make for themselves. Ellie was quiet for a moment. Mr. Harrington, she said, with respect. You just called me to ask me to use Cole's feelings for me as leverage to push him toward a business decision that benefits your legacy. I'm asking you to help him survive. You're asking me to manipulate someone who just learned to trust me. To protect something that has already cost your family everything that actually matters. A pause. I'm going to tell him you called. I think you should plan for that. She hung up. Cole sat in Ellie's apartment with Jake's surgery 30 days from closing and federal agents outside his building, and his father's voice still in the air between them. He called you, Cole said. Yes, to use you. He thought I was the right tool for the job. Cole looked at the table. He ran the calculation. 20 years of training running every angle at once. Rains had removed his operational freedom. His father was working against him. Jake's care was on a countdown. The empire which he had built to give him power over exactly these kinds of situations was the thing being used against him. I've spent 20 years building something I called power, he said quietly. Tonight that thing is a weapon someone else is using against a 16-year-old kid and his sister. Cole, I don't know if I can fix this. You can, but you're trying to solve it the same way you built it. And that logic is exactly what Rains is counting on. She leaned forward. Jake has never had one single person fight for him with nothing to gain. Not one. I need you to be the first. Not to save the Empire. Just because he's 16 and it's right. Can you do that? He picked up his phone. Not his security chief. He called Marcus. Get me the direct line to the senior agent on the Rains inquiry. Federal Field Office, Marcus. Cole, I'm going to give them what they need. Everything, whatever it takes to move on Rains and clear the compliance holds. All of it. You know what that costs. Yes, Marcus, what changed? Cole looked around the apartment, the medications, the textbook. Jake at the window, who had turned around and was watching the way he always watched. Like someone who had learned early that adult conversations determined the conditions of his life. I stopped counting the cost, Cole said, and started looking at what I was paying it for. The cooperation took 72 hours. Cole provided documentation Rains had been suppressing for years. The compliance holds were unwound as evidence of Rains's operation. Jake's surgery was rescheduled. The surgeon called back personally. The cost to Cole was real and significant. Operations dismantled, assets frozen pending proceedings. Partners who quietly disappeared. He accepted every consequence without negotiation. Arthur came to the penthouse after the attorney notified him. He sat across from Cole, and he was 70 years old, and he looked all of it. Everything I built, he said. You built something that treated people as acceptable costs, Cole said. That's what you built. I did it for you. I know you believe that. Cole looked at him. Mom wanted to be a doctor. She had a Johns Hopkins textbook in that library with her name written in it. She gave up half of who she was to stand next to what you were building. Arthur went very still. I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to build anything that asks someone else to. Arthur stood at the door before leaving. He was not a man who cried. He was a man who went still when something shifted inside him. Your mother would have liked the girl, he said. It was not an apology. It was as close as Arthur Harrington got to one that night. Cole sat alone in the penthouse after he left. Marcus, now, I genuinely don't know. That might be the most honest thing you've said in 20 years. Don't make it a thing, Marcus smiled. Too late, she already did. The hardest thing about becoming someone different is that you have to do it where people can see you. Not having arrived somewhere clean and finished. Becoming visibly imperfectly. In front of the people who knew who you were before. Cole Harrington had spent his entire adult life controlling what people were allowed to see. The strange thing of finally trying to be honest was that it required giving that up entirely. It was the most frightening thing he had ever faced. He had been shot at 14 times. 6 weeks after Chapter 9, 3 operations were dismantled. 11 associates under separate federal investigation. Significant personal assets frozen. Business partners who had quietly redirected their loyalty elsewhere, which was their right. His net worth was a different number than it had been 2 months ago. He didn't hide this. He didn't spin it. He let people see the cost of the thing he had chosen. Marcus, was it the right move? Cole, yes, Marcus, even knowing all of it. Cole, I know what I lost. I know what I kept, Marcus. What did you keep? Cole thought about it. The ability to sleep, he said. And someone who might agree to coffee. Arthur and Cole were not reconciled. They had phone calls once a week now, short, careful, circling the things they didn't yet know how to say. Some damage takes years to close. If it closes, the story was honest about that. One conversation doesn't undo 30 years. Cole had stopped expecting it to. He started the Margaret Harrington Foundation 6 weeks after the federal cooperation, named for his mother. Medical education grants for students who had been forced to leave for financial reasons, not a scholarship in the traditional sense. A specific intervention for a specific failure he now understood through one specific person. He reviewed every application file himself. His administrative team found this unusual. When they asked why, he said, "Because I want to understand who's on the other side of the decision. I spent 20 years making decisions from one side of a table without knowing what the other side looked like." The selection process was fully anonymous. The 5-person faculty panel at Northwestern's medical school did not know who the funder was. The funder did not see applicant names until after selection was complete. 12 students were selected in the first cohort. When the files came to Cole's desk with names restored, he recognized one of them by the handwriting in the margins, the medical notes, the color-coded annotations. He didn't call her immediately. He wanted her to find out the right way first. Adelt received the letter from the foundation on a Tuesday morning. She read it twice at the kitchen table. Then she called Northwestern's financial aid office. She asked the director to explain the selection process. The director explained, fully anonymized review. Applicant identities masked during evaluation. Faculty panel with no knowledge of the funder's identity. No possibility of donor influence on selection after the fact. The grants were irrevocable once issued. Ellie sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended. Then she called Cole. "I checked," she said. "I know you would. Why did you make it anonymous?" "Because if they chose you because of me, it wasn't worth anything. If they chose you because of you, it was worth everything." A pause. "They chose you because of you. I didn't need to tell them who you were." "Your file did that." Silence on her end. "You don't have to accept it," he said. A pause. "I'm going to accept it," she said. She came to the penthouse the following week. Not as an employee, she knocked, which was new. He opened the door, which was also new. She sat in the living room she knew better than her own and looked at him across the coffee table. "My mother said something when I told her about the foundation." "What did she say?" "She said a man who knows what he owes you before you ask is rare. She said don't let pride make you foolish. She sounds like someone I'd like to meet. She'd have opinions about you. Good ones, complicated ones. She'd say you're a work in progress. She'd be right. She'd also say that's the best kind. The ones who've already finished usually stopped in the wrong place." From the hallway she also said he has good eyes. "Ellie, Jake." "I said you could wait." Jake wheeled in completely unabashed. He stopped, looked at Cole the way he looked at everything, directly and without flinching. "You fix what you broke," he said. "Cole, working on it, Jake." "Good answer." He wheeled back out. 3 weeks later, Ellie asked Cole to meet her at a diner 6 blocks from her apartment. Worn wood tables, handwritten specials on a chalkboard. The smell of coffee and something baking in the back. She chose it. Cole arrived 20 minutes early. Jeans. A jacket that didn't signal anything. No security outside. He ordered black coffee at the counter. $4, and tipped the full amount of the bill on top of it, because he had watched Ellie do that for years and understood now what it meant. He sat at a corner table with both hands around the cup. His hands were steady. He had been awake since 4. Ellie arrived exactly on time. She ordered her own coffee, paid for it, came to the table and sat across from him, 2 cups. Bought separately. Neither of them owing the other anything for the others. "I want to ask you one thing," she said. "Ask. Who are you when you're not the most feared man in Chicago?" He looked at her. "I don't know yet," he said. "Good," she said. "That's a good answer. A man who already knows who he has stopped growing. The ones still figuring it out are still going somewhere. That might be the most med school thing you've ever said. She smiled, the first real full unguarded one he had ever seen from her. I've been saying med school things for years, she said. You just started listening. Outside Chicago in March. Oscillating between cold and the suggestion of something warmer, not quite committing either way. The light through the diner window was ordinary and indirect, and nothing like the view from the 38th floor. It was better. 6 months later, Ellie Morrow walked the corridors of Northwestern Memorial with a stack of textbooks under one arm and a coffee in the other. She scrubs on the days the clinical observation program allowed students in. She moved through those hallways like someone who had come home to a place she never got to finish leaving. In the oncology wing, Ruth Morrow was in a private room, better than she'd been in 2 years. New protocol responding well. The specialist was cautiously optimistic. When the specialist stepped out, Ruth looked at Ellie and said, "He's good for you, Ellie." "Mom, Ruth, I'm just stating a clinical observation." "Ellie, you're a retired nurse." "Ruth, observation skills don't retire." Across the city, Jake Morrow was 6 weeks into post-surgical recovery. He was not walking yet, he might. The surgical team gave it 60%. He was not waiting for the percentage. When the therapist said again, Jake was already going. Cole's phone buzzed, a photo. Jake standing, both hands on the parallel bars. Face locked in fierce concentration with something at the edges of it that was close to joy. From Ellie, first time in 2 years. Cole was in his foundation office. A regular office. He looked at the photo for a long time before he typed back. "Tell him I said he's the bravest person I've ever met." "Ellie, he knows, I tell him every day." Cole, dinner tonight, 3 dots gone. 3 dots again, study group until 8. After, I pay for mine, Cole. Always, he set the phone down. Outside the foundation office window. Chicago in September, golden and specific. The light the city gets in fall when it decides to look exactly as beautiful as it actually is. He had a meeting in 20 minutes with the next cohort of grant applicants. He had read every file himself, he always did now. He picked up the top file. A 23-year-old from Evanston, first-generation college student. Left nursing school when her mother's illness required someone to be home full-time. He knew this story, not just from Ellie. He understood now that it was not a rare story. It was a common one. It happened constantly, to people whose names he would never know, in apartments he would never see. In supply closets on lunch breaks where they made lists on the backs of receipts and tried to look like people who had a plan. The difference between those people and the people who made the decisions that affected them was not intelligence or character or effort or worth. It was margin, that was it. That was the whole thing. Some people had enough room to breathe and some people didn't. And the ones who didn't kept the world running and remained invisible inside it, and were only noticed when they became inconvenient. That was wrong. He knew it now, the way you know things, when someone honest has finally shown you what you've been looking at. He made a note on the file. He was going to read this one carefully. As this story comes to its end, what remains is not just the memory of its events, but the deeper meaning hidden beneath every decision, every silence, and every consequence that unfolded along the way. Because in the world of the Mafia, or any world shaped by power, fear, loyalty, and betrayal, nothing ever truly exists on the surface. Every action carries weight, every choice carries cost, and every truth, no matter how long it is buried, eventually demands to be seen. And that is where the real lesson of this story begins. At its core, this is not a story about criminals, hospitals, or hidden empires of control. It is a story about human vulnerability under pressure. When people are pushed into extreme emotional and moral situations, they reveal who they truly are, not who they pretend to be in comfort, but who they become when silence becomes dangerous and truth becomes expensive. This story reminds us that power does not define identity. Pressure reveals it. And once revealed, it cannot be undone. One of the most important lessons we learn here is that control is never as absolute as it appears. Those who believe they are pulling all the strings often discover that life is not a system to be mastered, but a force to be understood. The more someone tries to dominate outcomes through fear or authority, the more fragile their position becomes when unexpected truth enters the equation. In contrast, those who act with awareness, who observe, listen, and understand rather than dominate often hold a quieter but far more enduring strength. This story also teaches us that silence can be both protection and destruction. Many characters choose silence out of fear, loyalty, or strategy, believing that withholding truth will preserve stability. But silence, when used to avoid confrontation with reality, becomes a hidden form of self-destruction. Because truth does not disappear when it is ignored, it only waits. And when it finally surfaces, it rarely arrives gently. It arrives with consequences that no one is fully prepared for. Another powerful lesson lies in the nature of trust. In a world built on hidden motives and shifting alliances, trust becomes the most valuable and most dangerous currency. To trust blindly is to risk everything, yet to trust nothing is to lose one's humanity entirely. The characters in this story navigate this fragile balance, showing us that trust is not about certainty, but about courage, the courage to believe in someone despite the possibility of betrayal, and the wisdom to recognize when that belief must be reassessed. But beyond power, control, silence, and trust, the deepest message of this story is about transformation. No character remains unchanged. Every experience leaves an imprint, whether visible or invisible. Pain reshapes perspective. Betrayal reshapes judgment. Love, even in its most unexpected form, reshapes priorities. And through all of this, we are reminded that human beings are never fixed identities, they are evolving consequences of everything they survive. Perhaps the most important truth this story offers is that redemption does not always come in dramatic moments. Sometimes it comes quietly, in realization, acceptance, or in the simple understanding that a different path was always possible. Even in worlds where mistakes carry heavy consequences, the possibility of change still exists, not as a guarantee, but as a choice that must be made consciously and often painfully. And so, as we step away from this story, we are left with a reflection that extends far beyond its characters or setting. We are reminded that life itself operates in similar ways. Power shifts, truth surface, illusions collapse, and people are revealed not by what they claim to be, but by what they choose to do when it matters most. In the end, every environment, whether peaceful or dangerous, simple or complex, tests the same fundamental qualities: integrity, awareness, courage, and empathy. This is why this story matters. Not because of its mafia world, its tension, or its drama, but because it mirrors something universal about human existence. It shows us that survival is not just about strength, but about understanding. That victory is not always about control, but about clarity. And that the most lasting form of power is not dominance over others, but mastery over oneself. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.